Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Avery Ash, Head of Global Public Policy and Product Strategy at INRIX. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
We're excited to have you here because you and I have had some long, fascinating conversations offline, and I had no idea the rich data set that INRIX has, so thank you for coming on the podcast today to shed some light on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to discussing how all these interesting connected vehicle data elements that we've been working with for the past decade plus are finally realizing their promise of driving some interesting and exciting new developments across the mobility landscape.
Let's dive into that because INRIX operates in over 60 countries and collects aggregated anonymous aggregated data from 500 million vehicles, mobile devices, mobile apps, parking lot operators, mobile carriers, and smart meters all in real time. How's that possible?
It takes a lot of work, and it's something that's taken a long time to get good at. So INRIX has been doing this for 15 years plus. We started with the idea of real-time traffic. At that point, when you were getting a traffic report, you were quite literally flying a helicopter up into the air and radioing down what you were seeing for either vehicle counts or traffic conditions. What we saw the opportunity for was to take connected vehicle data, at that point primarily from telematics devices, and use that information about how quickly vehicles were traveling to provide a virtual version of the manual counting traffic information across the entirety of a road network. So we started using that connected vehicle data at first to provide information on speeds. Then once that data density and our ability to crunch that data got good enough, we graduated from just looking at traffic conditions, so red, yellow, green in a map, to looking at things like incidents on the roadway. Where were we seeing dangerous slowdowns, so high deltas in speed? What was taking place because of those? Was that because of a crash, a weather event, construction work? From there, we moved on and we're looking at, again, aggregated and anonymized information about where people travel. So origins, destinations, what paths people took. At our outset, we were providing this information primarily to an end user in the form of a driver to help them to get from A to B more effectively and efficiently by understanding traffic conditions. What we found out about a decade ago was that there is a substantial appetite from the public sector for these same sorts of insights, not at an individual level, but at an aggregated level. So understanding where across their road network, state DOT's road network, there is congestion. Where does that congestion routinely occur and why? Where are people most frequently traveling? What do the volumes look like on particular roadways? When there's a construction event or a crash, where and how do people divert around those crashes? This is really critical information for managing a road network and something that we've helped to pioneer over the past 10 years. Now we're moving beyond that. What's the next generation of connected vehicle data able to unlock? I think that's what's really exciting about some of the work that we've undertaken here over the past couple of years.
You've been 15 years old. The last 10 years, you must be really proud. You've been on the CNBC disruptor list, and you're still on there, and you're still going strong. So I'm thinking this, you're tracking where people travel from. So we have Thanksgiving or we have Christmas, and we see all the airport traffic with vehicular. Is that coming from INRIX data? You're saying, okay, you don't want to go to LAX this time. You don't want to go to Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta this time due to all that traffic. Is that your data?
So we can certainly help provide information about when's the best time to leave for your Thanksgiving or holiday travel. We do have a partnership in partnership with AAA. We do regular holiday travel forecasts. So when's the best time to leave? When do we expect the busiest hours and the busiest days to be around particular holidays? How many people do we expect to be actually hitting the road? That's useful information, obviously, for an individual traveler, right? If I live here in Washington, D.C., knowing that if I get out of town before rush hour starts on Thursday, my trip north or south is probably going to be easier than if I leave Friday at 5 p.m. Some of that's pretty intuitive, but it's helpful information to have nonetheless. And it's great to have data to back it up, to actually show when those times are. But from a planning perspective, it's also helpful to understand, not just around a holiday, but maybe a sporting event, a festival. What does that do for vehicle traffic? How do you plan before it? How do you understand the impact in real time? And then how do you assess what the impact was after the fact so that you can plan better for similar sorts of events in the future?
Well, that's a really great point, because if you're driving down to Dulles, you could have construction on the road going down to Dulles, or if you have the Washington Nats playing, you can have traffic in and around that game. And we talked about traffic, but traffic creates a lot of emissions. Are you tracking emissions data?
So we're not tracking emissions data, but we are seeing an appetite for the sorts of information we have about where and how vehicles travel and congestion rates. Obviously, congestion and vehicle travel is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So understanding where those emissions are taking place and what the impact of a particular project is. We're not measuring what the emissions are. We're measuring what the vehicle behavior is, which can be a proxy for, and you can extrapolate to, relative emissions as a result of that activity. One really interesting example of that is with a recently introduced signal analytics product that we released here a couple of years ago. So what we do is we use our connected vehicle data to evaluate the performance of signalized intersections. So things like percent arrival on green, the performance of a particular traffic light split failure. So that frustrating point when you pull up to a light that's red, it goes green, you don't make it through, so you hit two red lights, same light. It's called a split failure. And what we look at is, the context of the emissions from vehicles that are sitting in traffic at those stopped at a traffic light. When you improve the performance for those signalized intersections, you can have a marked impact, not just on aggregate emissions, but on localized emissions as well. And that's a really interesting way for us to think about flipping the script on the sorts of convenience-focused metrics that we've historically measured, and start thinking about some of the metrics that transportation industry is increasingly caring about, whether that's environmental friendliness or vehicle safety, for example.
I want to get into safety in a minute here, but I want to stay on vehicle behavior. For instance, as society shifts towards the electrification, hybrid, all-electric EVs, will you be able to gather anonymous data says, okay, this is a very busy charging spot. Consumers don't go to this charging spot, so you might want to perhaps put more chargers in spot A because spot B doesn't have the consumer traffic to justify the investment?
Yeah, that's a great use for the sorts of travel pattern information that we have, that we can provide. So if you are looking to plan out a charging network, knowing where people are driving is a really great factor to be considering. So understanding for a particular area, what locations would allow you to service the greatest population, understanding what distance those sorts of trips might be taken. So if there's a high volume of vehicles, but they're all going relatively short distances, maybe that's not as critical an area to have a charging station as along a heavily trafficked thoroughfare. There's a lot of vehicles that are traveling longer distances. So creating that kind of that data-driven charging network is something that we've seen an increased appetite for. We're not providing data on the charging stations themselves. We're providing the data that allows you to place those charging stations more effectively.
More effectively has a positive impact on the environment. There's less emissions. It also has a positive impact on the driver. They're not going to be stressed out. They're going to know when they have to go if they're going from their home to the grocery store or the school, that there's a convenient charger there. So it's really having a positive impact. Another positive impact that INRIX is doing, you have a partnership with GM in which General Motors Future Roads partnered together with INRIX to create Safety View. You have data from 15 million vehicles. How will this data be used? And the most importantly, what's the benefit to the local community?
Yeah, so this is a product that we have been working on for almost 2 years now. So we spent a lot of time sitting with and working with particularly city departments of transportation, some counties and MPOs as well, and working through the challenges that they were seeing in building a comprehensive safety action plan. Oftentimes that gets referred to as a Vision Zero plan. In building those, in updating them, and in measuring the impact of those plans. The challenge has been that in order to effectively do that sort of safety planning, it required bringing in all sorts of different data sets. So that would include crash data that you might have available at the local level. That might include volumes data that you're going out into the field and collecting over some period of time, rolling out those tubes to count cars. Maybe you're bringing in some information around speeding, either from police observations or from fixed speed cameras. Maybe you're bringing in some information around vulnerable road users. So those road users that are not surrounded by a protected metal box, bikes, scooters, skateboarders, pedestrians, power chair users, et cetera. And finding those sorts of data sources is expensive and challenging and very limiting in the ability for the safety plans to live up to the expectations of, and frankly, the need based on the road safety challenges that we've seen here in the US. So what we found with General Motors was a partner who was similarly looking to leverage the promise of connected vehicles to finally start to provide some real value in informing the planning for and around our road network. So we have now brought together premium data sets from INRIX, so including our vulnerable road user index, so a relative understanding of where there are more or fewer vulnerable road users moving across the road network. Our volumes information, which is focused on passenger and commercial vehicles. Our what we call our speed distribution profile. So that takes a look at not just the average speed along the roadway. If I am hit by a car while riding my bike, I don't really care what the average speed is on that roadway. I care what the speed of the vehicle that hit me was. So we can provide as a breakdown by 5-mile-per-hour buckets of what percentage of vehicles are traveling at a range of speeds. That's really useful information when thinking about safety planning and the impact of either policies or projects on vehicle speeds. And then we bring in some data from GM Connected Vehicles, which you'd mentioned, around what's called the risk score. So that includes 5 components: crashes, seatbelt usage, vehicle body type, speeds, and hard braking events. And I think hard braking events is kind of a really good example there, where we take all the road segments across an entire area. We look at the relative proportion of hard braking events that took place on that segment. We stack rank all those segments, and we provide a score from 0 to 5, 5 being the highest, 0 being the lowest, of hard braking events that took place. We then bring those premium data sets together with local crash data, so you can view these all and analyze these in real time. And we bring in information from the US Census around demographics, so we can start to provide a lens of equity in those conversations and considerations, particularly when it comes to income, race and ethnicity, and age.
You look at heartbreaking, it's sad. You have an individual or it gets in a crash and perishes, that nobody talks about it. It's no news. But if a celebrity or somebody famous gets in the crash, it's all over the news. But that individual that wasn't celebrity, they were celebrity to their family. And it's sad that there's not enough attention put on the fatalities and crashes. And in the INRIX data, this was sad, but this is really important to highlight. In Washington, D.C., 20% of drivers travel at least 10 miles an hour above the 15-mile-an-hour speed limit in school zones. It's stupid. Your kids go there. They're vulnerable. They're excited to go see their teachers. They're excited to go see their friends. And all they're focused on is getting into the school, but yet people speed. 20% of drivers travel at least 10 miles above the 15-mile-an-hour speed limit in schools in Washington, D.C. Why and how do we stop the nonsense?
So it's frustrating. It's probably also not surprising to many, right? Anyone who's gone to drop off their kids, or frankly has walked around Washington, D.C., knows that people will drive too fast, particularly too fast for a posted speed limit or too fast for safe roadway operation. I think what's important to call out there is DC's efforts around what are called safe routes to school. So there is a national trend which takes place at local levels to start applying data and resources to improve this sort of a challenge that we have quantified here in Washington, D.C. around behavior around schools. So let's protect our most vulnerable road users, our children, as they are going to school or being picked up from school. Makes common sense. And we now have the data to really start to effectively do that work. So in DC, the first effort to address these speed challenges was twofold. First was around the presence of crossing guards. So actually having somebody who is stopping vehicles at a crosswalk, who is charged with ensuring that school age children are able to safely get to school. And the second, though, would be around a reduction in speed limits on residential roads where speeds are not posted from 25 to 20 miles per hour. Um, that's a generally pretty popular with people who live on those streets where vehicles are traveling too quickly. I think what we have started to show with this data, though, is that just a policy change alone is not going to be enough to have the sort of impact that we as a community or we as DC Department of Transportation would want to see. But it's important to have that first step in quantifying. So now that DC has dropped the speed limit for many of these streets from 20 to 25, that changes what they're able to do, particularly when you can quantify, as you mentioned, that vehicles are not actually adhering to that required behavior. And what that means now is next step is how do we ensure that vehicles are traveling those speeds, right? If just having signs is not going to do the trick, what's next? And there are lots of options for solutions. You can change the design of the roadway. You can put in raised crosswalks. You can put in speed bumps. You can put in signs that speed limit's 15 when children are present. You can make those signs flashing. You can have crossing guards. You can do curb bump outs. There's a whole laundry list of sorts of treatments and solutions that you might start to think about to help to actually get people to adhere to those lower speeds, to have that impact on lowering vehicle speeds around schools. What we are able to do now with the Safety View product that we launched with GM is quantify the impact of those efforts. So if you go ahead and you deploy crossing guards around Barnard Elementary School, where I live in Petworth, we can show you the next quarter what that has meant for speeds during that morning school drop-off or evening school drop-off. Has it actually resulted in lower average speeds? Has it resulted in lower proportions of vehicles who are traveling at 10 miles an hour or greater above the speed limit? We would hope it would, but we won't know until we see the data from it. And what's great to see is the appetite from the safety planning community, particularly in the public sector, to start measuring their impact, right? To wanting to have information about how effective have these programs been so that they can move to the next step. Try something quickly. Is it impactful? If it is, roll it out more broadly. If it's not, move on to the next strategy. I think that's sort of an innovative approach to transportation safety is best informed by the sorts of data elements that we're able to present in a product like Safety View with General Motors Future Roads.
If you look at that, and we'll take it to the local level, it gives the principal, the school board, the opportunity to potentially plan the infrastructure differently based on the data. They say if they implemented speed bumps, or I've seen it where by my daughter's school, these cars, it's a 20 mile an hour, 15 mile, and they go 40, 50 miles an hour. So I call over to the mayor. I said, enough's got to stop. And God bless him. He puts the cop with the radar gun and then the cop with the chaser cycle. And all suddenly, boom, boom, boom. Traffic the speeds went way down. But then after the officers left, speed went right back up. It just seems that it doesn't get ingrained in the head. Oh, no cop, I can speed.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good example that you can't really expect one silver bullet solution that's going to solve this problem. It's kind of that concept of the safe systems approach that has been increasingly focused on by US DOT and other agencies, where you kind of have to look at the holistic sense, right? This is not just about driver education or behavior. It's not just about road design. It's not just about enforcement. It's not just about policies that are in place. It's all of these in concert is what's going to make a difference in vehicle speeds and ultimately fatal and serious crashes taking place around schools. So, enforcement may be one part of that solution, but what we can do with a product like Safety Viewer with the data that INRIX has is prove whether there was an impact or not, right? So rather than having to rely on anecdotal details from constituents, so, oftentimes it's the squeakiest wheel that gets the grease. And in the absence of good data, some data or even bad data is better than no data at all in many instances. So, there has been historically, DOT has focused on those areas that receive the most complaints or where they've been told there's a problem. Best case scenario, actually go out and measure and confirm if there's a problem. They can actually do a before and after study, quantify what that impact has been. But in many instances, you get enough complaints from a particular block of, hey, we really want a speed bump outside. You get you get a local rep who helps to carry that. You roll out the speed bump. Everyone kind of celebrates victory, and you don't go back and measure, did this actually prevent crashes? Did this really reduce speeds on a particular segment? And it may have, but without that information, I think we are really missing an opportunity to confirm that the projects that we're putting in place are money well spent and are having the intended impacts. And I think that's a really key point from the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, which US DOT rolled out here as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is going to be providing $1 billion annually, $400 million each year for planning, specifically to safety programs that are focused on these sorts of initiatives like Safe Routes to School or Vision Zero or Towards Zero Deaths. That is going to finally match the appetite that we have seen from the safety planning community, either stakeholder community or public sector agencies, with the funds that are required to do this right. And I think that's been a challenge we've heard for many years from many of our customers is we understand that this data would help us be more effective with our deployment, but we don't have the funds to be able to source that data, or an expectation that a very limited, much more money gets spent on implementation than planning. It's harder to do a ribbon cutting for planning of a project than it is for the deployment of a project. And it's really, I think it's really heartening. You kind of had talked up front about what's it going to take for some change to see that US DOT has literally put their money where their mouth is on the Safe Streets and Roads for All program and requiring that 40% of the funds from that, $400 million each year, will be dedicated to the planning process to ensure before we start breaking ground, before we start putting projects in place, that they are data driven, that we're actually prioritizing the areas that are most in need of treatment, and that I think most and even more importantly, after those projects are in place, how are we going to measure whether they were successful or not? And it provides that level of accountability that I think is really important for not just ensuring that funds are well spent, but ensuring that we're actually able to make the sorts of changes that we want to see on our roadway.
We have to make changes. Thank you for highlighting the planning process. It's like I'll give you an example. It's like, okay, I want to build a house. Well, let's just go to Home Depot and put a bunch together, 2x4s, and have a house. No, you have to plan it. You have to do rendering. You have to understand, is there water underneath your house? Are you in an earthquake zone? Are you in a flood zone? You have to put the planning in place. So the $400 million a year commitment to planning is a very positive step. We learn a lot from data. The data around our schools will make it safer. It will allow those local officials to plan better, to properly the roads. And then another big issue that we have to overcome, and INRIX is, in my opinion, has the best data anywhere I've ever seen on this, is congestion data. You publish the global traffic scorecard every single year. It's well done. To listeners, I highly recommend you check out the INRIX 2021 Global Traffic Scorecard. It will open your eyes. And in that data, you stated that the average American driver lost 36 hours to congestion a year. I'm reading this data, and the big question I wanted to ask you, how do we solve the congestion problem?
So it's a great question, and it starts to get to some of the solutions that we offer. So INRIX is in the business of being a scorekeeper more than we are being in the business of fixing the problem, right? So what we can do is quantify what the impact of let's say a congestion relief project or a safety project is. We're not going to go out and build the project ourselves. We're going to provide the ability to measure what the impact of that project had been. So you mentioned our congestion scorecard. You mentioned the 36 hours being lost each year due to congestion. The $500+ each for each person in wasted time. That adds up to some pretty staggering numbers across the country. This is obviously not just a US problem. This is a global challenge. I think what's been interesting to see is the return post-COVID of congestion. We're seeing some changes in how that congestion is spread out. So the peaks for morning or evening commutes. And then also, though, thinking about how congestion, which is historically how we've thought about the performance of projects, intersects with things like speeds and ultimately with something like safety, where there are some loggerheads here of an increase in congestion is not always, and most of the research would show, it is not linked with an increase in fatal or severe crashes. Depending on the research, it can be linked to an increase in crashes, but the severity actually decreases as congestion increases. Probably not too surprising because we know that vehicles traveling faster mean worse outcomes for those who get hit. So there is a bit of a push and a pull with what are we measuring and why, right? If we're talking about a major highway or a major corridor used for commercial vehicle traffic, congestion or travel times may be the metric that a road authority cares the most about. If we're talking about the street outside your daughter's school, we're probably not that interested in travel time that it's going to take to get through your daughter's school corridor, because faster travel time means the vehicle is, by definition, traveling faster, which is, as we just discussed, what you're actually looking to solve against. So what's been important for us is to diversify the sorts of metrics that we can measure for a particular roadway or a corridor or an intersection, and match the metrics that the road authority or constituents care the most about based on the sorts of use that we would hope that roadway to be having. And what we find is that the types of data, the types of metrics that are most impactful or most important can vary tremendously by the type of roadway and what you're measuring and planning for. So I think that's some really important context to add, in that question of congestion. Congestion is something we need to solve for, but in certain circumstances, right? And understanding where and what do we mean by congestion? Is that just the time that it's taking for vehicles to travel? Is it the time that vehicles are spent sitting idle? Is it the time that is it the number of vehicles on a particular roadway? And once we've done that due diligence of establishing what are the key performance indicators that we care the most about, what are we trying to correct for or solve for or improve, then we can start matching the types of projects that are required to generate that improvement, and then use INRIX data to measure whether or not you've actually been successful with whatever the particular project might be.
On the what we are measuring and why point, I want to ask you this. London, according to your data, is the world's most congested city, where drivers lost 148 hours to congestion in 2021. But yet, the city has a daily 15-pound congestion tax. What were they measuring to put the congestion tax in? It's not stopping. It's still number one in congestion.
So that's some interesting nuance on the way that we measure congestion. So when we talk about congestion, historically, we've talked about travel time for passenger commercial vehicles. For London, I think there's some pretty interesting data in there about the congestion tax that was implemented was alongside additional changes within the city that focused on not just travel time and congestion for passenger vehicles, but congestion and travel time for bikes, for public transit, including buses and the tube. So we actually saw after that congestion pricing go into effect, probably not surprisingly, but again, having the data on this is important. We saw bus ridership jump. So while we have seen, certainly it's true to say that we have seen congestion increase in London, that's only going to tell a partial part of the story, right? That's going to tell what it has meant for passenger and commercial vehicle travel times. What it's not going to tell you, and what would be great to layer on some data in that sort of analysis, would be what has it meant for fatal and severe crashes within that congestion zone during the same time. If you're seeing congestion continue to stay flat or actually increase, and you're seeing fatal and serious crashes going up, then something's not going right. But if you're seeing congestion staying flat and you're seeing fatal and severe crashes actually decline, or you're seeing bus ridership or bike travel times increase, we're not saying whether, or we wouldn't be saying whether that's a good outcome or a bad outcome, but it starts to provide you the metrics to measure, what was the point of this, right? What are we trying to achieve through, in this case, a policy change with a congestion tax, in the same way that you'd want to measure the output of installing a predictive bike lane, right? If the metric that you're measuring the success of that bike lane by is vehicle speeds, then you're probably likely to take a view that the bike lane was not successful. If you're measuring it based on bicycle throughput or fatal or serious crashes, and based on the evidence we have around protected bike lanes, you would expect both ridership to increase and also fatal and severe crashes to decrease. That might actually be a huge success. So again, whether a project is successful or in need of further assessment really depends on what you're measuring. But again, in order to have that conversation and to have it in a way that allows us to make more informed decisions, we need to agree up front with what we're trying to solve for, and then B, have access to data like INRIX's data that will allow us to keep score, right? To show what has the impact been across a variety of factors based on changes to the physical infrastructure or changes to policy. And I think once you start framing these discussions around data, you can start to have a more honest and informed dialogue that lets you get at the root of what you're trying to solve for, rather than trying to deal with just kind of bits and pieces of data that don't tell a complete story. And in not telling a complete story, mean that we're ultimately going to get off track from successful planning for our city roadways.
Very, very valid points. We have to understand what we're trying to solve across the pond. New York, the fifth most congested city in the world, and there's currently debate now to put a congestion tax in. While bus ridership might have went up in London due to the tax, New York City has a crime problem. It's the crime's running rampant. I want to put some data into this because as 3/4 of New Yorkers said crime was a very serious problem in a February 22 Quinnipiac University poll. Furthermore, this is the highest number since the question was first asked in 1999, with a fear of crime and a rising crime rate, which has increased 30.5%. I repeat, increased 30.5% in July 22 compared to July 21. What's the impact going to be? How's New York City going to measure that when a consumer might be afraid to go on the bus because of the publicly available data from the NYPD stabbings? They're going to opt for single rider vehicles. What will that impact be? How do you properly, in your words, set that benchmark to know if it's successful or not?
Yeah, I think it's an important and an interesting point around the need just to not view a transportation solution in the context of transportation data. So I mentioned within our safety view product, we bring in demographic information and understanding where fatal and serious crashes or higher incidences of speeding, particularly speeding around schools, where that is taking place in neighborhoods that have higher proportions of the elderly or higher proportions of children, or lower income neighborhoods, or neighborhoods with higher proportions of certain racial or ethnic designations. It starts to provide additional context beyond just what do the transportation stats say. So I think that's kind of an important place to start, is bringing in those outside data sets, whether it's demographic information or 311 reports or school parent surveys or crime information, will really start to help inform this process and ensure a more holistic view of this sort of planning. I think the example that you gave of New York City is an interesting one. So back in 2019, you might remember that New York City opened their 14th Street busway in Manhattan. And I mean, you would have thought that the world had been lit on fire when this happened. People really freaked out that this was going to cause massive congestion on surrounding streets, and how are people going to travel? And what they've found was, and this is where I think again it's really important to enter into these sorts of policy changes with eyes wide open, and with a willingness and frankly a plan for how you're going to measure the impact. So The INRIX research team did a study around that 14th Street busway during its first week of operation, and found that, frankly, the fear of that initial congestion was misplaced, and that actually the 14th Street busway had no discernible impact on performance changes for neighboring roads. It certainly had an impact on bus speeds and bike speeds along that roadway, but was somewhat counterintuitive, right? People assumed that this was going to be displacing traffic on the surrounding roadways, and that we were going to see a marked impact in congestion and an increase in travel times. We didn't see that impact. So I think that's where going into something like a congestion pilot, or really any other change to roadway design or roadway access, necessitates a plan for how you're going to measure it, right? So we don't know what the impact would be in New York City of congestion pricing. It might be flat on congestion. It might actually decrease travel times if vehicles going in and out of the city decrease. Maybe it increases bus ridership or subway ridership. We don't know the answer on that, but we do now have the ability to measure in near real time what these impacts are, to ensure that the assumed impacts are in fact the case, and that there aren't either misperceptions or misconceptions of how these sorts of transportation changes will actually impact people's daily travel habits.
Let's get into the economics of New York City. The chair of the MTA has very publicly come out and said, we're going bankrupt. We're going to have to raise the fare of the subway. MTA controls the Metro North, a very popular commuter line from the suburbs of New York and Connecticut. And then you have the Hudson Valley line. And then you have all the trains that come, Long Island Railroad, known as the LIRR, that comes in from Long Island into the city. And due to their budget shortfalls, and this is all publicly available data, they're going to raise the prices. What if that price was equal or pretty close to the congestion tax? Would it just basically wash each other out? Said, oh, well, I have to pay the increased price to go on the train. Why don't I just drive my vehicle? And because then I have the convenience to go when I want to, where I want to. Perhaps I'll just Uber in or Lyft in.
So I think that the answer is we don't know yet, right? So I think that what's interesting though is, like, that's a great example where the data that we have would be able to tell you the day after any sort of fare increase might go into effect, what has the impact been on passenger vehicle commuting traffic? Did we see that travel times decreased or increased? Do we see that vehicle volumes spiked? Do we see there was a spike in the morning and evening rush hours? Do we see people were spreading out their commutes over the course of the day? And we saw a lot of that similar data during COVID. And as we've come out of COVID here, around the flattening of those morning and evening rush hours in many markets, as people have either grown accustomed to more flexible work schedules, or are now moving to hybrid work schedules where there's just not the same daily commute peaks. So I think that's a great example, though, where a change that is taking place on transit, you can measure the impact on vehicle movement using data sources, and you can plan for and respond to and know the impact of in near real time to understand both the expected outcome or the preferred outcome you're trying to generate, as well as any spillover impacts that you might have as a result of that sort of a change, whether it's congestion pricing, whether it's an increase of subway or railway fares, whether it's an increase in gas prices. Certainly with gas prices being much higher, we did a little bit of work around what that meant. And there was certainly interest on what does that mean for vehicle volumes, with people driving less as a result of it. Do we see people taking shorter trips? Do we see people using transit more? Again, transit data isn't what INRIX provides. We can provide the data on the other side of the house around vehicle movement, which when viewed in concert with transit data can help tell a complete story.
You look at a complete story. Your old background and how we met was in autonomous vehicles. And why is there not policy conversations around drop-off and pickup zones that could be utilized today for UPS, FedEx, Amazon, and then for vulnerable passengers that need more time to get out of the vehicle, they can pull off to the side? Why is there not more conversations around drop-off and pickup zones?
Oh, Pudo, one of my favorite topics, right? Pick up and drop off. Yeah. I think it's funny. We saw a lot of that conversation starting before the pandemic. So we saw, Miami-Dade County had piloted a handful of those, particularly focused on TNCs, on the ride-hailing companies, but really could be used for by any sort of a pickup and drop-off service. We saw some of that here in Washington D.C. The city working in concert with the TNCs, certain times of day, days of the week, rather than letting people drop off on busy vehicle travel thoroughfares, throw on the hazard lights and have people hopping in and out of cars, both frustrating and also dangerous. Let's put those pickup and drop off spots on side streets. Would require temporary removal of parking spaces in some instances. Can you kind of cover that from a pickup and drop off fee? Lots of other parts of that conversation. But we saw those sorts of that sort of dialogue starting to grab hold. I think we saw a lot of that shift during COVID away from pickup and drop off, although we did see some of that, right? With the rise of food delivery. I know we saw some of the some steps by cities here in the US to reclaim curbside space and use it for DoorDash, Seamless, Caviar, whomever, pick up and drop off for food delivery services outside of restaurants. And then we obviously also saw a lot of the temporary repurposing of on-street parking in areas, particularly where it wasn't being used as much during the pandemic, repurposed for outdoor seating, right? So we have seen an appetite to rethink the way that we use our curbside away from just parking spaces. I'm interested to see now that we are getting back into, some semblance of normalcy post COVID. Yeah, yeah. So great example in the city of Austin. Back when we had first met, the idea of how do you manage scooter operations would have been met with blank stares. You fast forward just a couple of years, and the challenge of how do you manage an influx of scooters and scooter riders? Where do you put them? How do you keep them from blocking sidewalks? How do you prevent them from ending up in fatal and severe crashes? How do you address helmet usage? All these become kind of front of mind issues for a Department of Transportation. And what we have seen over the course of the last 10 years is it seems like by the year, if not more frequently, we are seeing marked changes in the sorts of challenges that a Department of Transportation, particularly at the city level, is having to deal with. The pandemic certainly brought new challenges. The rise of TNC in the kind of early 2010s certainly brought this. The advent of autonomous vehicles will continue to bring changes and demands for both roadways and curbsides, the driverless sidewalk delivery bots. There's all sorts of challenges with who and how and why are we going to use our roadway, our curbside, and our sidewalk. And the need for data to really drive that management is what we think is going to be most critical, and where we're excited to have INRIX playing a role in that space.
It's really exciting when you look back there. Scooters were all over the place, and then along comes Colin Roche and Swift Mile. They developed the charging stations, and they're doing really well. It came out of a need. He'd had this idea. He won a contest and got a electric bike, and noticed them everywhere. If I build a charging station, it was all that really great innovation that came out of that problem. And cities are loving them because it's cleaning up the clutter. So staying on the city thing for a minute. In your opinion, you've done this a long time. What is the best way for cities to prepare for the eventual rollout and scaling of autonomous vehicles in large numbers?
I think the first step is to get a really clear understanding of how your roadways are currently being used and what behavior looks like across your road network, so across all road users. And with that knowledge, armed with that clear understanding of how your road network is being used, then you can start to think about where do you fit autonomous vehicles into your mobility suite in a way that is going to solve problems as opposed to just technology for technology's sake, or even worse, in a case that is actually exacerbating underlying problems because the technology is not a great fit for the travel demand needs or for the built environment. In the same way that we don't really want scooter riders traveling on the highway, we might not want commercial trucks traveling on residential roads. Same sorts of considerations need to take place when it comes to automated driving systems and ensuring that the technology is being matched with the operational domains that are going to be most impactful and most appropriate for for that technology.
Putting this whole conversation into context, what impact will data have on the future mobility? Will data define the future mobility of how it's rolled out eventually?
I think we're already seeing that, right? Like the appetite for deploying, whether it's bikes and scooter operators, whether it's Lyft and Uber, whether it's autonomous vehicle operators, the starting point for where do we put these vehicles and how do we manage them when they're in operation, it's extremely data driven, right? The rebalancing and reallocation of dockless bike and dockless scooter sharing is the key between being profitable and not profitable, right? Ensuring that there are enough vehicles when people want to use them, and ensuring that that they have ample charges, and ensuring that you're managing those devices across a region is critical. Those same dynamics that have applied to bikes and scooters, to Lyft and Uber, will apply to autonomous vehicles as well, right? You're going to need to see that data-driven and oftentimes real-time data-driven understanding of where and how are vehicles operating, where is demand taking place, in order to actually meet the needs of the moving public, which at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is where and how do people want to move, and matching that with solutions that meet their needs of where and how they want to travel.
And the most important part is, as an operator, how are you going to do it profitable so you can grow your business and scale? Take the Larry Page and Sergey Brin model and focus on profitability and building a big business. Because when they first met with John Doerr, they said, how big do you think the business is? And Larry says to John Doerr, $10 billion. He goes, a $10 billion valuation? He goes, no, $10 billion in revenue a year. That's the mindset you have to take. And look what Larry and Sergey built with Google, now Alphabet. Well done, gentlemen. Can't forget Eric Schmidt for the fine work that he did during his time there. And Avery, as we look to wrap up this super insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
I would like to start thinking about where can we find new data sets and new places for and new insights out of existing data that would really help us to do a better job at planning and deploying the limited resources we have at the transportation challenges that we're facing.
Well said, because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is data-driven mobility. Avery, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.